Opening. The puzzle in the sky. Picture this. It's 1942, somewhere over the Pacific. A young American gunner sits behind a .50 caliber machine gun on a bomber, watching enemy fighters approach at 300 miles per hour. His instincts scream at him to aim directly at the target, to put the crosshairs right on the enemy plane. It seems obvious, doesn't it? You aim at what you want to hit. That's how you shoot a tin can off a fence, how you throw a ball to someone standing still, how every hunting story since the dawn of humanity has taught us to think about hitting a target. But here's the problem. When that gunner followed his instincts and aimed directly at the enemy aircraft, he missed. Again and again and again. The bullets streamed through empty air while the enemy fighter roared past unscathed. Across the Pacific theater, across Europe, in every engagement where American aircraft faced enemy fighters, gunners were burning through ammunition at an alarming rate while scoring precious few hits. American commanders faced a crisis. Bombers were being shot down. Fighter pilots were struggling in dogfights. The enemy seemed to have an uncanny ability to dodge American fire. Was it superior training? Better aircraft? Some tactical advantage that U.S. forces hadn't identified? The answer turned out to be something far more fundamental and far more surprising. American gunners were aiming wrong, not because they lacked courage or determination, but because they were fighting against something far more powerful than any enemy air force. They were fighting against human intuition itself. The solution, when it finally came, seemed to contradict everything these young men had learned about shooting. Instead of aiming at the target, they would learn to aim behind it. Instead of following their instincts, they would learn to trust mathematics. And when they did, the results were dramatic. Hit rates doubled. Enemy aircraft fell from the sky in numbers that had seemed impossible just months before. The tide of aerial combat shifted, and with it, the entire trajectory of the war in the air. This is the story of how American gunners learned to shoot at where their targets weren't, and in doing so, mastered one of the most counterintuitive skills in the history of warfare. It's a story about physics and psychology, about the gap between human perception and mathematical reality, and about how the U.S. military transformed the way it trained warriors to fight in 3 dimensions at speeds the human brain never evolved to comprehend. The problem: missing the target. To understand why American gunners were missing, we need to first grasp the sheer scale of the challenge they faced. Aerial gunnery in World War II wasn't like any kind of shooting that had come before it. These weren't hunters tracking deer through the woods, moving at a gentle trot. These weren't soldiers shooting at enemy infantry, moving across a battlefield at running speed. This was something entirely new in human experience, trying to hit a target moving at hundreds of miles per hour in 3 dimensions, while you yourself were also moving at hundreds of miles per hour, often in a different direction. Let's break down the math of a typical engagement. An enemy fighter might be approaching at 300 miles per hour. That's 440 feet per second. The bullets from a .5 caliber machine gun travel at about 2,900 feet per second. Fast, certainly, but not instantaneous. If an enemy fighter is 1,000 feet away when you pull the trigger, your bullets will take about 1/3 of a second to reach that point in space. That doesn't sound like much, does it? 1/3 of a second? But in that 1/3 of a second, that enemy fighter traveling at 440 feet per second will have moved approximately 147 feet. That's nearly 50 yards. That's half a football field. If you aimed directly at where the plane was when you pulled the trigger, your bullets would pass through empty air behind the target. The plane would be long gone by the time the bullets arrived at that point in space. And that's assuming the simplest possible scenario, a target moving in a straight line directly across your field of vision. Real combat was infinitely more complex. Enemy aircraft would be diving, climbing, banking, rolling. They'd be approaching from angles, not just passing in a neat perpendicular line. The bomber you were on would be maneuvering too. There might be crosswinds at altitude.
The air density would affect both the aircraft and the bullets. The curvature of the bullet's path due to gravity and air resistance, though small at short ranges, became significant at longer distances. Early in the war, American gunners approached this problem the way humans naturally approach any shooting problem. They aimed at the target. It's what we're hardwired to do. When you throw a ball to someone walking across a yard, you don't calculate vectors and velocities in your head, you just aim at them, and your brain makes unconscious adjustments based on a lifetime of experience with objects moving at human speeds. When you shoot at a deer running through the forest, you develop an instinct for leading the target, aiming slightly ahead, but this instinct is built on animals moving at perhaps 30 or 40 miles per hour at most. Nothing in human evolution, nothing in human experience before the 20th century had prepared our brains to judge speeds of 300, 400, or 500 miles per hour. Our perceptual systems simply hadn't evolved to handle it. And so gunners did what came naturally. They aimed at what they could see, which was where the airplane was at that moment. The result was catastrophic inefficiency. Reports from early combat missions told the story in stark numbers. Gunners were expending thousands of rounds for every confirmed hit. Bombers would return from missions with their ammunition exhausted, their gunners swearing they had the enemy in their sights repeatedly, and yet with no enemy aircraft to show for it. Fighter pilots reported the same frustration. They could get an enemy plane in their gun sight, fire long bursts, and watch the tracers stream past the target without connecting. The psychological toll was significant. These were brave young men who had trained hard, who wanted desperately to protect their aircraft and their fellow crew members. They were doing exactly what they thought they should be doing, aiming carefully, tracking the target, pulling the trigger, and yet they were failing. Some began to doubt their own competence. Others grew frustrated with their equipment, certain that there must be something wrong with the guns or the sights. The real problem, though, was much more fundamental. Our human brain, for all its remarkable capabilities, is fundamentally a pattern-matching machine built for a world that moves at biological speeds. We're extraordinary at predicting where a person running across a field will be in the next second. We can catch a thrown ball with ease, our subconscious minds calculating arcs and speeds without any conscious mathematical thought. But these abilities break down completely at the speeds of modern warfare. An aircraft moving at 300 miles per hour is moving more than 10 times faster than the fastest human sprinter. It's moving faster than a cheetah, faster than almost any animal in nature except a diving falcon. Moreover, the situation was complicated by a quirk of human perception called motion parallax. When you're moving at high speed yourself, objects at different distances appear to move at different rates relative to you. This is why when you're in a car, nearby objects seem to whiz past, while distant mountains appear to move slowly. For a gunner in a bomber traveling at 200 miles per hour, trying to judge the actual speed and trajectory of an enemy fighter at varying distances became an almost insurmountable perceptual challenge. Their brain was receiving visual information that their evolutionary programming had no framework for interpreting accurately. Adding to the confusion was the fact that tracers, special rounds that burn brightly so gunners can see where their fire is going, were made up of only a fraction of the ammunition. Typically, every fifth round was a tracer. This meant gunners could see some of their bullets, but not all of them, and had to mentally extrapolate the path of the full stream of fire from the glowing traces they could observe. It was like trying to follow a dotted line while most of the dots were invisible. The enemy, meanwhile, seemed to have figured something out. German and Japanese pilots both appeared to be achieving better hit rates. Some American commanders wondered if Axis forces had some secret technology or training technique. Intelligence officers pored over captured aircraft and interrogated prisoners looking for the secret. What they found was simpler and more humbling. Enemy pilots were, in many cases, simply better trained in deflection shooting, the art of leading a moving target. But it wasn't just about training methods. The Axis powers had started aerial combat earlier in conflicts like the Spanish Civil War and the Sino-Japanese War. Their pilots and gunners had learned these lessons through brutal trial and error in actual combat. They'd had more time to develop their skills and their training programs. American forces, coming later to the air war, were trying to compress this learning curve, to teach in months what the enemy had learned over years of combat experience. The question facing American military leadership was clear. How could they rapidly improve the shooting accuracy of thousands of gunners and pilots without changing their training methods? Traditional training methods, sending men to gunnery ranges to shoot at towed targets, weren't producing results fast enough. The towed targets moved far slower than actual enemy aircraft, and the training environment bore little resemblance to the chaos and stress of actual combat. Men who scored well on the range still missed consistently in battle. Something had to change. The status quo was costing lives, costing aircraft, and threatening the success of the entire air campaign. The solution would require rethinking not just how gunners were trained, but how they conceived of the very act of shooting at a moving target in the sky.
Understanding the physics, the mathematics of deflection. To solve the problem of aerial gunnery, American military researchers first had to fully understand the physics at play. This required breaking down the problem into its mathematical components, a task that sounds straightforward but proved surprisingly complex given the number of variables involved. At its heart, the problem of hitting a moving aircraft is a problem of interception. You're not trying to hit where the target is, you're trying to hit where the target will be when your bullets arrive at that point in space. This requires predicting the future position of the target based on its current position, velocity, and trajectory, while simultaneously calculating the flight time of your bullets to various points in space. Let's start with the simplest possible scenario to understand the basic principle. Imagine an enemy aircraft flying perpendicular to your line of sight at a constant altitude, at a constant speed of 300 miles per hour, 440 feet per second, at a distance of 1,000 feet. Your bullets travel at 2,900 feet per second. The time for your bullets to reach the 1,000-foot distance is 1,000 divided by 2,900, which equals approximately 0.345 seconds. In those 0.345 seconds, the enemy aircraft will travel 440 feet per second times 0.345 seconds, which equals approximately 152 feet. This means you need to aim at a point 152 feet ahead of where the aircraft currently is. Since a typical fighter aircraft might be 30 feet long, you're aiming roughly 5 plane lengths ahead of the target. This is the required lead or deflection. Now, that's the simplest scenario, and real combat was never that simple. What if the enemy aircraft is approaching at an angle rather than passing perpendicular to you? What if it's climbing or diving? What if it's changing speed? Each of these variables changes the calculation. When an aircraft is approaching at an angle, you need to break its velocity into components. Only the component of velocity perpendicular to your line of sight matters for calculating deflection. If a plane is coming directly toward you, it has no perpendicular velocity component. Its position relative to your line of sight isn't changing sideways, only its distance is changing. In this case, you don't need to lead it sideways at all, just account for its changing distance and any vertical movement. Conversely, when a plane passes perpendicular to you, all of its velocity is perpendicular to your line of sight, and you need maximum deflection. This relationship between angle and required deflection means that the amount you need to lead a target constantly changes as the target's position relative to you changes. An enemy fighter making a head-on attack requires no side deflection at first, then requires increasing deflection as it gets closer and starts to pass to the side, then requires maximum deflection at the moment it's directly abreast of you, then requires decreasing deflection as it pulls away.
A gunner needs to be constantly adjusting their aim throughout an engagement. Vertical deflection adds another layer of complexity. If an enemy aircraft is diving or climbing, you need to lead it vertically as well as horizontally. Gravity affects your bullets too, causing them to drop over distance. At 1,000 feet, a bullet might drop several feet from its initial trajectory. This means you need to aim slightly high to compensate, but how much you need to aim high depends on the distance, which is constantly changing. Distance itself is one of the most challenging variables. Unlike shooting on the ground, where you might use landmarks to estimate range, the sky offers few reference points. An aircraft at 500 feet might look similar to a larger aircraft at 800 feet. Human depth perception is excellent at close ranges, but becomes increasingly unreliable beyond about 30 feet and virtually useless beyond a few hundred feet. Gunners had to learn to estimate range based on the apparent size of enemy aircraft, a skill that required memorizing the dimensions of different aircraft types and learning to judge their distance based on how much of the gun site they occupied. The speed of the enemy aircraft was equally difficult to judge. Without ground reference points, how do you tell if a plane is traveling at 250 or 350 miles per hour? The difference is crucial. It changes your required deflection by 40%. Yet in the heat of combat, with adrenaline flowing and multiple things happening simultaneously, accurately judging speed was extraordinarily difficult. Then there's the matter of your own motion. If you're in a bomber that's banking, your frame of reference is tilted. What looks to you like a horizontal pass might actually be an angled one when measured against the true horizon. If your bomber is in a turn, the enemy aircraft's apparent motion includes a component that's actually due to your own movement, not theirs. Gunners needed to mentally subtract their own motion from the apparent motion of the target. Another calculation that's simple enough to describe, but incredibly difficult to do intuitively in combat conditions. Crosswinds add another variable, especially at the high altitudes where many bombers operated. A strong crosswind affects your bullet's trajectory, pushing them off course. The faster the wind and the longer the flight time of the bullet, the more significant this deflection becomes. At 25,000 feet, where temperatures are far below zero and winds can exceed 100 miles per hour, this isn't a minor correction. It's a significant factor that can make the difference between a hit and a complete miss. American researchers, including mathematicians, physicists, and engineers, worked to model all these variables. They created tables showing required deflection for various combinations of target speed, angle, distance, and altitude. They built mechanical computers, analog devices using gears and cams that could calculate the required lead automatically based on inputs for target distance and speed. Some advanced aircraft, particularly bombers, were equipped with computing gun sights that would solve these equations in real time. But there was a problem with all this technology and mathematics. It was useless if the gunner didn't understand the underlying principle. The most sophisticated computing gun sight in the world couldn't help you if you didn't input the correct range and speed. And it couldn't help a fighter pilot at all, since most fighters relied on simpler fixed gun sights. What the military needed was not just better equipment, it was better understanding among the gunners and pilots themselves. The research revealed something crucial. The amount of deflection required in aerial combat was far larger than most people intuitively expected. At typical combat ranges and speeds, a gunner might need to aim 50, 100, or even 150 feet ahead of a target. In terms of angles, this might mean aiming several degrees ahead of the target, putting your sights on empty air while the target is clearly visible elsewhere in your field of view. Everything in a gunner's training and instincts told them this was wrong, that they were aiming at nothing. Overcoming this instinct required not just practice, but a fundamental shift in how gunners conceived of their task. The mathematics also revealed why tracers, while helpful, could sometimes be misleading. Tracers were slightly lighter than regular bullets and experienced slightly different ballistics. At longer ranges, they might diverge noticeably from the path of the regular ammunition. If a gunner relied solely on walking their tracers onto the target, they might actually be walking their regular bullets off target. The best technique was to use tracers as a rough guide, but to trust the mathematics and aim for the correct calculated lead, letting the regular ammunition do the real work. Perhaps most importantly, the mathematical analysis showed that there was no single correct rule of thumb that would work in all situations. Some training programs had tried teaching simple rules like aim 3 plane lengths ahead. But this only works for a narrow range of scenarios. Different speeds, different angles, different distances all required different deflections. What gunners needed wasn't a simple rule. They needed to internalize the principle of deflection shooting so thoroughly that they could intuitively adjust their aim for any situation. This realization led to a complete overhaul of American aerial gunnery training. The new approach would focus not on memorizing tables or following rigid rules, but on developing an intuitive understanding of deflection through repetition and practice with realistic scenarios.
The training revolution, teaching instinct. Once American military researchers understood the mathematics of deflection shooting, the next challenge was figuring out how to teach this counterintuitive skill to thousands of gunners and pilots. This wasn't a problem that could be solved simply by explaining the math in a classroom. Adult humans had spent decades building intuitions about how objects move and how to aim at them, intuitions that were now a liability. The training needed to rebuild these intuitions from the ground up. The traditional approach to gunnery training had been straightforward. Take students to a range, give them targets to shoot at, and let them practice until they improved. For aerial gunnery, this meant towing fabric sleeves behind slow-moving aircraft and having student gunners fire at them. But this approach had serious limitations. The towed targets moved far more slowly than enemy aircraft would in combat, perhaps 150 miles per hour compared to 300 or 400. The shooting was done from stable platforms, not from aircraft in combat maneuvers. Perhaps most critically, students weren't learning the principle of deflection shooting. They were just trying different things until they got lucky hits. The breakthrough in training came from understanding that what gunners needed wasn't just practice. They needed the right kind of practice, structured to help them build new instincts. This led to what became known as progressive training, a systematic approach that built skills from simple to complex. The training revolution began on the ground, not in the air. Instructors developed ground-based training aids that could teach the principle of deflection without the expense and danger of aerial training. One of the most effective was the skeet shooting range, adapted specifically for military training. Skeet shooting, originally developed as a hunting training tool, involves clay targets launched at high speed through the air. Shooters must lead these targets, aim ahead of them, to score hits. While the speeds involved are lower than aerial combat, the principle is identical. By starting with skeet shooting, trainers could teach gunners the basic concept of deflection in a controlled environment where they could fire thousands of practice rounds and receive immediate feedback. But the military's adaptation of skeet shooting wasn't just about borrowing a civilian sport. Instructors modified the ranges to simulate specific combat scenarios. Clay targets were launched to simulate enemy aircraft passing at different angles. Some stations had targets crossing perpendicular to the shooter, maximum deflection situations. Others had targets approaching at shallow angles, less deflection required. Still others had targets launched at varying distances, forcing shooters to adjust their lead based on range. The genius of this approach was that it let students fail safely and cheaply. A student could miss 100 clay targets, learning a little from each miss, without wasting expensive aircraft ammunition or risking any lives. Instructors could watch students' technique, identify when they were aiming directly at targets instead of leading them, and provide immediate correction. Students could shoot, miss, understand why they missed, adjust, and try again within seconds, a feedback loop that was impossible to achieve in actual aerial training. As students progressed, the training increased in complexity. After mastering stationary shooter scenarios with skeet, students moved to training that simulated their own motion. Some ranges installed moving platforms where shooters stood, or rotating towers that spun slowly.
forcing students to account for their own motion while also leading the target. This began to simulate the complex geometry of shooting from a moving aircraft. The next phase involved actual aerial training, but with carefully structured progression. Students didn't start by shooting at realistic high-speed targets from aircraft in combat maneuvers. Instead, training began with the simplest possible scenarios and gradually increased in complexity. Initial aerial gunnery training might involve shooting at a towed target from a straight and level aircraft, with the target also moving straight and level. Only one variable needed to be managed: the perpendicular motion of the target. Students could focus entirely on judging speed and applying the correct deflection. Instructors could observe students' tracer fire and provide specific feedback. You're still aiming directly at the target. You need to lead by at least 3 aircraft lengths. As students demonstrated competence at one level, training progressed to more complex scenarios. The towing aircraft might vary its speed, forcing students to adjust their deflection. Then the shooting aircraft might bank or turn, requiring students to account for their own motion. Later stages involved targets at varying altitudes, targets making evasive maneuvers, and eventually full combat simulation with defending aircraft maneuvering while student gunners attempted to track and engage. Throughout this progression, instructors emphasized the underlying principle rather than specific rules. Students weren't just told, lead by X amount in Y situation. They were taught to observe the relationship between their fire and the target. If tracers are passing behind, increase your lead. If they're passing in front, decrease it. The goal was to develop an intuitive feel for the right amount of deflection in any situation. A crucial innovation was the development of moving picture training films. These films, shot from the perspective of a gunner, showed enemy aircraft approaching and passing at various angles and speeds. Students would watch the film with a training gun sight mounted in front of the screen and practice tracking the aircraft, maintaining the proper lead throughout the engagement. The films could be stopped and started, replayed at different speeds, and used for detailed analysis of each student's technique. These films served multiple purposes. They allowed students to see dozens of different attack scenarios without requiring actual flying time. They let instructors demonstrate correct technique, running the same scenario with proper leading technique so students could see exactly where to aim. And they provided a safe environment for students to confront their instincts. Many students, when first using these film trainers, found themselves unconsciously tracking the aircraft directly, putting their sights on the target rather than ahead of it. Seeing this mistake in slow motion helped them recognize it and correct it. Another training innovation addressed the psychological challenge of aiming at empty air. Many students struggled with the disconnect between what their eyes told them, there's the enemy aircraft, and where they needed to aim, a spot with nothing visible in it. To overcome this, instructors used a technique called railroad tracking. In railroad tracking, students were taught to imagine a railroad track extending ahead of the enemy aircraft in the direction of its motion. The student's goal was to aim at a point on this imaginary track ahead of the train, the aircraft. This gave students a mental framework for deflection. Rather than aiming at nothing, they were aiming at a specific point on an imaginary line, projected from the target. It sounds abstract, but for many students, this visualization technique was the key to internalizing deflection shooting. Instructors also emphasized the importance of sustained fire. In ground combat, a rifleman might fire single shots carefully aimed. In aerial gunnery, the doctrine became sustained burst fire, holding the trigger down and firing continuous streams of bullets while tracking the target. This accomplished several things. First, with targets moving so quickly and ranges so difficult to judge precisely, a sustained burst increased the probability that some bullets would connect even if the deflection wasn't perfect. Second, the tracers from a sustained burst created a visible stream of fire that gunners could use to walk their aim onto the target, adjusting continuously as they fired. The concept of walking fire became central to American aerial gunnery doctrine. Rather than trying to calculate the perfect deflection and then fire a burst, gunners were taught to start with an educated guess at the right deflection and then adjust their aim based on where their tracers were going. If tracers pass behind the target, smoothly increase your lead. If they're passing in front, decrease it. Keep firing and adjusting until you see strikes on the target, then hold that lead as long as the target remains in range. This technique had the advantage of playing to human strengths rather than fighting them. Humans are excellent at making rapid, continuous adjustments based on feedback. It's how we walk, how we catch balls, how we perform countless everyday tasks. By framing deflection shooting as a continuous adjustment problem rather than a precise calculation problem, trainers were giving students a task their brains were naturally equipped to handle. As American training doctrine evolved, instructors also recognized the importance of stress inoculation. Students might perform well on a calm practice range, but freeze or revert to old instincts when enemy tracers were coming toward them. To address this, advanced training included scenarios designed to stress students. Targets would shoot back safely with marker rounds or flash effects, instructors would shout and create distractions, and students would practice while fatigued and under time pressure. One particularly effective training involves simulation of combat conditions in which students had to engage multiple targets in quick succession. This prevented students from overthinking their deflection calculations and forced them to rely on the instincts they'd been building. When faced with 3 enemy aircraft attacking from different angles simultaneously, a gunner doesn't have time for mental math. They need their deflection instincts to be automatic. The training also addressed a crucial psychological factor: confidence. Early in the war, many gunners doubted their ability to hit fast-moving targets. This lack of confidence led to hesitation, poor trigger discipline, and excessive stress that further degraded performance. The progressive training system, by giving students repeated successful experiences at each level before progressing to the next, built confidence systematically. By the time students faced realistic combat scenarios, they'd already succeeded at similar tasks dozens of times. They knew they could do it because they'd already done it. Instructors carefully tracked student progress using standardized metrics. Hit rates were recorded for each training session, allowing both students and instructors to see objective improvement over time. This data also allowed the military to validate training methods.
The results: doubling the hit rate. The proof of any training program is in its results, and the results of the American aerial gunnery training revolution were dramatic. Across multiple theaters of war, in both bomber defensive gunnery and fighter offensive gunnery, hit rates approximately doubled, and in some cases more than doubled after the new training methods were implemented. The improvement showed up first in training metrics. Before the training revolution, students at aerial gunnery schools typically achieved hit rates of around 2 or 3% on towed targets, meaning they struck the target with only 2 to 3 bullets out of every 100 fired. After the implementation of progressive deflection training, hit rates at the same schools rose to 5 to 7%, and the best students achieved rates above 10%. This was in training conditions, against predictable targets at known speeds, but it represented a fundamental improvement in skill. More importantly, the improvement translated to actual combat. Analysis of combat camera footage and post-mission reports showed clear increases in accuracy among units that had received the new training. Fighter pilots were achieving more kills per engagement. Bomber gunners were driving off or shooting down more attacking fighters. Perhaps most tellingly, bomber loss rates declined in formations with crews trained in the new methods. The 8th Air Force, conducting daylight bombing raids over Europe, provided particularly clear data. In early 1943, before widespread adoption of deflection training, bomber gunners claimed approximately 1 enemy aircraft shot down per 1,000 enemy attacks. By late 1943 and into 1944, after the training had been fully implemented, this ratio improved to approximately 1 per 500 attacks, a doubling of the kill rate. While these numbers include some confirmed kills and some claims that may have been optimistic, the trend was clear and consistent across many units. Fighter squadrons showed similar improvements. The famous ace pilots, those with 5 or more confirmed kills, universally described using deflection shooting techniques. When interviewed, many of these elite pilots described their shooting not in terms of aiming at aircraft, but in terms of aiming at points in space where aircraft would be. One ace described it as shooting at the future.
a perfect encapsulation of the deflection concept. The improvement wasn't just about more enemy aircraft shot down, it was also about ammunition efficiency. Before the training revolution, fighter pilots and bomber gunners frequently expended all their ammunition in an engagement without achieving a kill. This left them defenseless for the remainder of the mission. A bomber gunner with empty guns couldn't defend against subsequent attacks, and a fighter pilot with empty guns had to break off and return to base. After training in deflection shooting and sustained burst discipline, ammunition lasted longer and was used more effectively. Statistical analysis of gun camera footage provided objective evidence of improvement. Gun cameras mounted on fighters recorded what the pilot's gun sight saw during engagements. Early in the war, analysis of this footage showed that pilots were typically placing their gun sight directly on enemy aircraft and then missing as the aircraft moved away from where the bullets went. Later footage showed pilots consistently leading targets, with strikes occurring much more frequently. One particularly revealing study analyzed the combat performance of replacement pilots, those who arrived at operational squadrons after completing training. Pilots who had completed training under the old methods before mid-1943 required, on average, 15 to 20 combat missions before achieving their first kill. Pilots who completed training under the new methods after mid-1943 averaged their first kill within 8 to 10 missions. They were becoming effective combat pilots twice as fast. The improvement in bomber gunnery had strategic implications. When bombers could defend themselves more effectively, fewer escort fighters were needed to protect them. This freed up fighters for other missions, including offensive sweeps against enemy airfields and ground attack missions. The bomber formations themselves could penetrate deeper into enemy territory with acceptable loss rates, expanding the range of targets that could be attacked. German and Japanese forces noticed the improvement. Captured documents and post-war interviews with enemy pilots revealed that they recognized American gunnery becoming more accurate and more dangerous as the war progressed. Some enemy pilots changed their tactics in response, avoiding certain attack angles where they had experienced higher losses, or breaking off attacks earlier rather than pressing them home through increasingly accurate defensive fire. The improvement also had a psychological impact on American aircrew morale. Nothing is more demoralizing than feeling helpless against enemy attacks. When gunners knew they could fight back effectively, when they saw their tracers connecting with enemy aircraft and saw those aircraft trailing smoke or breaking off, it transformed their experience of combat. Instead of passive victims hoping the enemy would miss, they became active defenders with the tools and skills to protect themselves and their crewmates. Fighter pilots developed a well-earned confidence in their shooting ability. This confidence affected their tactics. Pilots who trusted their gunnery were more willing to take difficult deflection shots rather than waiting for perfect rear quarter positions. This aggressiveness often paid off, as a hit from a difficult angle was better than no hit from a perfect angle that never materialized. The training success also validated the broader pedagogical approach. The principle of progressive training, moving from simple to complex, with immediate feedback and emphasis on understanding underlying principles rather than memorizing rules, proved effective. This approach was subsequently applied to other training programs, from dive bombing to night fighting to aerial navigation. The lesson was clear. Properly structured training could overcome even deeply ingrained human instincts. However, the improvement wasn't universal or automatic. Units that received the training showed improvement, but the quality of instruction mattered. Units with excellent instructors who really understood deflection shooting principles produced students who performed much better in combat than units where instructors just went through the motions. This led to efforts to standardize instructor training, ensuring that the teachers themselves fully grasped both the technical and pedagogical aspects of deflection shooting. There were also individual variations. Some pilots and gunners took to deflection shooting naturally, quickly developing an intuitive feel for the required lead in different situations. Others struggled, particularly those who had previous shooting experience that had ingrained the wrong instincts. Hunters and competitive rifle shooters sometimes found it harder to adopt deflection techniques than students with no prior shooting experience because they had to unlearn old habits before they could learn new ones. The time required to become proficient also varied. While training programs could teach the principles of deflection shooting relatively quickly, developing true mastery, the ability to lead targets correctly under any conditions without conscious thought, took extensive practice. Some pilots achieved this mastery within a few dozen training sorties. Others required hundreds. In combat, pilots and gunners who survived long enough continued to improve, their deflection instincts honing with each engagement. Despite these variations, the overall trend was unmistakable. The American military had identified a critical skill gap, developed a science-based understanding of the problem, created an effective training program, and implemented it at scale across multiple branches and theaters. The result was a measurable, significant improvement. The success of American aerial gunnery training became a case study in how to train complex, counterintuitive skills. The principles developed during this period, progressive training, building on fundamentals, providing immediate feedback, and emphasizing understanding over memorization, would influence military training doctrine for generations to come.
The technology, computing gun sights and beyond. While training was the primary solution to the deflection shooting problem, technology also played a crucial role in improving American aerial gunnery. Engineers and inventors worked throughout the war to develop equipment that could help gunners and pilots apply deflection principles more effectively. The result was a series of increasingly sophisticated gun sights that represented some of the most advanced computing technology of the era. The simplest gun sights were fixed reflector sights, essentially illuminated crosshairs projected onto a glass panel in front of the pilot or gunner. These sights gave a reference point for aiming, but did no computing. The user had to judge deflection entirely through training and instinct. This was what most American fighters and bombers started the war with, and even with these simple sights, properly trained shooters could be devastatingly effective. The next step up was the ring and bead sight with range estimation markings. These sights included multiple rings of different sizes around the central aiming point. The gunner would match the apparent size of the enemy aircraft to the appropriate ring to estimate range, then use that range estimation to judge the required deflection. It was still mostly manual calculation, but it provided some reference points to help with the judgment. The real breakthrough came with computing gun sights, mechanical analog computers that could calculate the required deflection automatically if fed the right inputs. The most famous of these was the K-14 gun sight, which began to appear in American fighters in late 1944. This device was nothing short of revolutionary for its time. The K-14, based on the British gyroscopic gun sight, worked by having the pilot input the wingspan of the target aircraft using a dial control. As the pilot maneuvered his aircraft and tracked the target, a gyroscope in the gun sight sensed the rate of turn. The mechanical computer used this information along with the target size input to calculate the proper deflection and move the illuminated sight picture accordingly. Instead of a fixed crosshair, the K-14 displayed a reticle that automatically moved to show where the pilot should aim. In practice, this meant a pilot could focus on tracking the target and managing his aircraft, while the gun sight did the deflection calculation. The pilot still needed to input the correct target wingspan and keep the target properly framed in the sight, but the sight itself handled the complex geometry. Pilots who received the K-14 found it dramatically improved their accuracy, particularly in difficult deflection shooting situations. However, the K-14 wasn't a magic solution. It still required proper technique. The pilot had to input the correct target wingspan. If he selected the wrong aircraft type, or if he misidentified the target's distance, which affected its apparent size, the sight's calculations would be wrong. The pilot had to smoothly track the target, because jerky movements confused the gyroscope. And the sight only worked for targets within a certain range. Too close or too far, and its calculations became unreliable.
Moreover, the K-14 arrived relatively late in the war. Most of the aerial combat took place with simpler sights, and most of the improvement in American gunnery came from training, not technology. The K-14 was a valuable tool, but it was most effective in the hands of pilots who already understood deflection shooting. Inexperienced pilots sometimes became overly reliant on the sight and didn't develop proper deflection instincts, which left them helpless if the sight malfunctioned or if they faced situations where the sight's limitations came into play. For bomber gunners, the technology was even more advanced. The famous Norden bomb sight used in American bombers was an analog computer for calculating bomb release points, but similar computing technology was applied to defensive gunnery. The Central Station Fire Control System, used on late-war bombers, was an elaborate setup where data from multiple gunner positions was fed into a central computer that calculated firing solutions and could even control remote gun turrets. These systems represented the cutting edge of 1940s computing technology. They used mechanical linkages, gears, cams, and electrical servos to solve differential equations in real time, the same mathematical problems that would later be solved digitally by electronic computers. For their time, they were marvels of engineering, requiring precision manufacturing and careful maintenance. Yet even with these sophisticated systems, the human element remained critical. The computers could only calculate based on the data they were given. If a gunner misidentified target range or speed, the computer would dutifully calculate the wrong answer. If target tracking was erratic, the solution would be unreliable. The best results came when skilled, well-trained gunners used these tools to enhance their capabilities, not replace them. The development of tracer ammunition itself was a crucial technology, though one that's easy to overlook. Tracers allowed gunners to see where their fire was going and make corrections. However, tracer technology had limitations. Early tracers sometimes burned inconsistently or burned out quickly. They added weight to ammunition loads, reducing capacity. And, as mentioned earlier, their flight characteristics differed slightly from regular ammunition, particularly at longer ranges. American ordnance engineers worked throughout the war to improve tracer performance, making them burn more consistently, last longer, and fly more like regular ammunition. They also experimented with different tracer ratios in ammunition belts. Too many tracers gave away the gunner's position and reduced the amount of regular killing ammunition. Too few made it hard to see where fire was going. The optimal ratio was found to be approximately 1 tracer for every 4 or 5 regular rounds. Another technological advancement was in the guns themselves. The Browning M2.50 caliber machine gun became the standard for American aircraft armament and was legendary for its reliability and hitting power. But even this excellent weapon required proper maintenance and feeding. Engineers developed improved belt feed systems, better gun heating management, and more reliable firing mechanisms. These might seem like minor technical details, but when you're at 25,000 feet over enemy territory with fighters attacking, a gun jam can be fatal. The ammunition itself evolved. Armor-piercing rounds improved, capable of penetrating increasingly thick armor. Incendiary rounds became more effective at igniting fuel tanks and engines. High-explosive rounds were developed for use against bombers. The mix of ammunition types in a belt, AP, incendiary, tracer, and regular, was carefully calculated to provide the best combination of different effects against different targets. Aircraft design also adapted to support better gunnery. Gun positions were relocated for better fields of fire. Improved turret designs gave gunners smoother tracking and faster traverse rates. Plexiglass quality improved, reducing distortion that could make aiming difficult. These seemingly small improvements, accumulated over hundreds of design iterations, contributed to the overall effectiveness of aerial gunnery. Communication systems improved as well. Better intercoms allowed bomber gunners to coordinate more effectively. Radio systems let fighter pilots communicate enemy positions and attacks. Ground-to-air communication improved, allowing controllers to vector fighters toward enemy aircraft with greater precision. While not directly related to deflection shooting, these communication improvements helped get shooters into position where their skills could be applied. It's worth noting that the enemy had similar technologies. German fighters used their own computing gun sights. Japanese pilots had tracer ammunition. But technology alone wasn't enough. The systematic training in deflection shooting principles, combined with good equipment, gave American aircrews the edge they needed.
The psychology, overcoming human intuition. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the deflection shooting problem was its psychological dimension. The challenge wasn't just teaching a technical skill, it was fundamentally changing how gunners and pilots thought about the act of shooting. This required overcoming deeply ingrained instincts and replacing them with new, counterintuitive responses. Human beings are prediction machines. Our brains constantly anticipate what will happen next based on past experience. When you see a ball thrown toward you, you don't consciously calculate its trajectory. Your brain predicts where it will be and moves your hands to that location. This works because your brain has had thousands of experiences with objects moving at ball-throwing speeds. But this prediction system breaks down completely with high-speed aerial targets. A fighter aircraft moving at 400 miles per hour is moving at speeds that human brains have no evolutionary framework for processing. We simply didn't evolve in an environment where anything moved that fast, except perhaps during falls. And falling is a special case where our perceptual systems shut down rather than trying to process the movement. This created a fundamental conflict. The gunner's eyes told him the enemy aircraft was here, right here, in his sights. Every instinct screamed to pull the trigger. His conscious mind might know intellectually that he needed to lead the target, but his subconscious, the part that actually controls most of our motor behavior, was pulling him toward aiming directly at what he saw. Psychologists working with military trainers identified this as a form of cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort experienced when trying to hold two contradictory beliefs simultaneously. In this case, I should aim at the target, instinct, versus I should aim ahead of the target, training. Resolving this dissonance required essentially rewiring the gunner's instinctive responses. The stress of combat made this psychological challenge even more difficult. Under stress, humans tend to revert to their most deeply ingrained behaviors. A gunner might perform perfectly on the practice range, leading targets correctly and achieving good hits. But in combat, with adrenaline flooding his system and enemy tracers coming toward him, that same gunner might unconsciously revert to aiming directly at targets. His conscious understanding of deflection shooting got overridden by primal instincts. This phenomenon, known as stress-induced skill degradation, is well documented in psychology. Under extreme stress, fine motor control deteriorates, conscious decision-making becomes impaired, and behavior becomes more automatic. The solution wasn't to eliminate stress, that was impossible in combat, but to make deflection shooting so automatic, so instinctive, that it became the default behavior even under stress. This is why repetition was so crucial in training. Students didn't just need to understand deflection shooting intellectually, they needed to practice it so many times that it became the automatic response. Psychologists call this overlearning, practicing a skill beyond the point of initial mastery until it becomes truly automatic. The goal was to make proper deflection shooting as instinctive as aiming at a stationary target once had been. The use of visualization techniques like the railroad track method mentioned earlier served a psychological purpose beyond just providing an aiming framework. They gave students a mental image to focus on, replacing the disturbing image of aiming at nothing with the more comfortable image of aiming at a specific point on an imaginary line. This reduced the cognitive dissonance and made the correct behavior feel more natural. Another psychological challenge was confirmation bias, the tendency to interpret information in ways that confirm existing beliefs. A gunner who believed he was aiming correctly might interpret tracers passing behind the target as evidence of wind deflection or sight misalignment, rather than as evidence that he wasn't leading enough. Instructors had to help students overcome this bias, teaching them to objectively assess where their fire was going rather than seeing what they expected to see. The social psychology of training also mattered for bomber crews in particular. Effective defensive gunnery required gunners to work together, to communicate, to cover each other's blind spots. This required trust that your crewmates would do their jobs, trust that they would call out threats, trust that they would engage targets appropriately.
Building this trust was partly about training together repeatedly until the crew functioned as a coordinated unit rather than a collection of individuals. There was also a psychological benefit to understanding that deflection shooting was difficult for everyone, not just personally difficult. When students learned that this was a universal challenge, that even experienced hunters and marksmen struggled with it initially, it reduced the sense of personal inadequacy that some felt. The problem wasn't that they were bad shots, it was that this was genuinely one of the most counterintuitive skills in warfare. The most successful training programs recognized that they were training minds as much as bodies. Physical technique mattered, but without the right psychological foundation, confidence without arrogance, automatic responses without rigidity, stress management, and the ability to override instincts with training, even perfect physical technique would fail under combat conditions.
The tactical evolution. How deflection mastery changed air combat. As American pilots and gunners became proficient in deflection shooting, it changed the entire nature of air combat. Tactics evolved to take advantage of improved gunnery, and these new tactics, in turn, drove further refinements in training. The relationship between skill and tactics created a positive feedback loop that made American air power increasingly effective. In the early stages of the war, American fighter tactics were relatively conservative. Pilots sought ideal firing positions directly behind the enemy aircraft, where deflection was minimal and the target was stable. This 6 o'clock position had been considered the optimal attacking position since the First World War. It allowed pilots to use their speed to close on an enemy, then follow behind, matching the target's maneuvers while firing from directly astern. However, achieving this ideal position was difficult. Enemy pilots knew it was dangerous and maneuvered aggressively to prevent anyone from getting on their tail. Engagements often became extended tail-chasing affairs, with one aircraft pursuing another through a series of turns and maneuvers trying to get that perfect rear position. Meanwhile, other enemy aircraft might enter the fight, and the pursuing pilot could himself become pursued. As American pilots became skilled in deflection shooting, new tactics became viable. Instead of spending valuable time and fuel maneuvering for the perfect tail position, pilots could take deflection shots, crossing shots where the enemy passed through the pilot's field of fire at an angle. These shots were more difficult, requiring precise leading of the target, but they could be set up much faster. A pilot might take a crossing shot at an enemy aircraft, damage or destroy it in a single pass, and then continue on to engage another target, rather than getting locked into an extended tail chase. This led to the development of boom and zoom tactics. Diving on enemy aircraft from higher altitude, taking a quick deflection shot during the high-speed pass, and then using the excess speed to climb back to altitude. Even if the first pass didn't achieve a kill, it often damaged the enemy or forced them into defensive maneuvers that set them up for a second attack or made them vulnerable to other friendly aircraft. Energy tactics, managing the relationship between altitude, potential energy, and speed, kinetic energy, became central to American fighter doctrine. Pilots learned to trade altitude for speed when diving to attack, and then trade speed back for altitude when climbing away. Mastery of deflection shooting made these high-speed passes effective because pilots could achieve hits during the brief moment when the enemy aircraft was in their sights, rather than needing to follow them for extended periods. Bomber formations improved gunnery changed defensive tactics as well. Early in the war, bombers flew in relatively loose formations. As gunner training improved, formations tightened. The goal was to create overlapping fields of fire where multiple gunners could engage any attacking fighter. An enemy pilot making an attack run might face fire from 5 or 6 different gunners, all trained in deflection shooting, all leading their target correctly. The volume of accurate fire created a gauntlet that enemy fighters had to run, dramatically increasing the risk of any attack. The combat box formation, developed by the 8th Air Force, was designed specifically to maximize defensive firepower.
3 squadrons would fly in a staggered formation, with each bomber's gunners covering the blind spots of nearby aircraft. When enemy fighters attacked, they faced a coordinated barrage from multiple aircraft, all firing deflection shots that created a cone of bullets through which the attacker had to pass. German and Japanese fighter pilots adapted their tactics in response to improving American gunnery. They learned to avoid prolonged attacks on bomber formations, instead making quick slashing attacks and breaking away before defensive fire could concentrate on them. They attacked from angles and directions where fewer guns could bear on them. Some pilots began using standoff weapons, bombs or rockets launched from beyond the range of defensive machine guns, specifically to avoid facing accurate defensive fire at close range. The tactic's use of altitude changed as gunnery improved. Early in the war, many engagements took place at medium altitudes where aircraft handling was predictable and visibility was good. As gunners became more accurate, the advantage shifted towards higher altitudes. At 25,000 or 30,000 feet, where the air is thin and cold, aircraft performance changed. Response times slowed, but for bombers with well-trained defensive gunners, height provided protection. Enemy fighters had to climb to reach them, arriving with less energy for maneuvering and facing the full weight of defensive fire while in the thin air that made their evasive maneuvers less effective. Fighter sweeps, groups of fighters flying ahead of bomber formations to clear the sky of enemy aircraft, became more effective as pilot gunnery improved. Instead of extended dogfights where individual battles lasted many minutes, skilled fighter pilots could achieve kills in single passes. This allowed sweep forces to clear larger areas more quickly, providing better protection for following bombers. The improvement in gunnery also affected aircraft design requirements. Early in the war, fighters were designed with maneuverability as the primary concern, the ability to outturn the enemy and achieve that perfect tail position. As deflection shooting became standard, speed and rate of climb grew more important than turn radius. American fighters like the P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt were optimized for speed and altitude performance, reflecting tactical doctrines that emphasized deflection shooting over turning combat. Gun armament changed as well. Early American fighters often carried 6 50-caliber machine guns spread across the wings. Later fighters concentrated firepower more, sometimes reducing the number of guns but making the remaining guns more effective. The goal was to maximize the weight of fire on target during the brief moments available in a deflection shot. Some aircraft even mounted cannon, which fired fewer rounds per minute than machine guns but delivered far more destructive power per round, ideal for scenarios where you might only get a brief firing opportunity. The tactics of mutual support evolved. Fighter pilots learned to work in pairs, with one pilot taking deflection shots while the other covered him, watching for enemy aircraft that might attack during the engagement. This wingman system, which had existed in basic form earlier, became more sophisticated as pilots learned to coordinate deflection attacks, with one pilot driving an enemy toward where his wingman was positioned to take a crossing shot. Bomber crews developed communication protocols for coordinated defense. When gunners spotted enemy fighters approaching, they would call out the position using clock positions, meaning bandits at 9 o'clock high meant enemy aircraft approaching from the left above the horizon. Other gunners would orient to the threat, and the formation might maneuver to bring more guns to bear. The integration of improved communication with improved shooting skill created a defensive system that was far more than the sum of its parts. Night fighting presented unique challenges for deflection shooting. Without visual cues about relative motion, judging the required lead became extremely difficult. American night fighters relied heavily on radar to position themselves for attacks, ideally approaching undetected from astern, where minimal deflection was required. When deflection shots were necessary at night, pilots relied almost entirely on tracer fire for feedback, walking their fire onto the target rather than trying to judge the correct lead visually. The use of mixed formations, combining different types of aircraft with different capabilities, became more sophisticated as gunnery skills improved. Heavy bombers with powerful defensive armament would be mixed with lighter, faster aircraft. Fighters would be integrated more closely with bombers, positioned to take advantage of situations where bombers' defensive fire drove enemy fighters into positions where the friendly fighters could engage them with deflection shots. Ground attack missions benefited from deflection shooting skills as well. Strafing ground targets often involved attacking at angles rather than straight on, to avoid ground fire. Pilots applied the same deflection principles they'd learned for air-to-air combat, leading the target, adjusting for their own motion, and walking fire onto target. The hit rates against ground targets improved dramatically once pilots started properly leading targets rather than aiming directly at them. The evolution of tactics demonstrates an important principle. Technical skill enables tactical options. When pilots and gunners couldn't reliably hit targets except from ideal positions, tactics were constrained by the need to achieve those ideal positions. As deflection shooting skills improved, tactics became more flexible, more aggressive, and more effective. The side with better trained gunners could dictate the terms of engagement, choosing when and how to fight based on broader strategic considerations rather than being limited by the technical challenge of achieving hits.
The human stories, aces and gunners. Behind the statistics and tactics were individual human beings, young men who learned deflection shooting and applied it in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. Their stories illustrate both the challenge of mastering this skill and its crucial importance in survival and success. Consider Major Richard Bong, America's highest-scoring ace with 40 confirmed victories. Bong wasn't a natural pilot when he entered training. Instructors noted that his flying skills were merely adequate. What set Bong apart was his gunnery. He obsessively practiced deflection shooting, spending extra time on the range and repeatedly reviewing his gun camera footage. Bong developed an almost supernatural ability to judge the correct lead for any angle of attack. In combat, Bong's tactics reflected his confidence in his deflection shooting. Rather than following enemy aircraft through extended maneuvers, he would position himself for a single high-deflection shot, take it, and achieve a kill. Fellow pilots marveled at his ability to hit targets at angles where they themselves wouldn't even attempt a shot. When interviewed about his success, Bong credited his shooting ability above all else, noting that many pilots could fly well enough to get into position, but few could consistently hit what they aimed at. Captain David McCampbell, the Navy's leading ace with 34 victories, demonstrated the importance of ammunition discipline combined with deflection shooting. During one legendary engagement, McCampbell and his wingman encountered a formation of 60 Japanese aircraft. Rather than spraying fire wildly, McCampbell carefully took deflection shots, firing only when he had a clear lead on a target. He shot down 9 aircraft in this single engagement, becoming an ace in a day, and had ammunition remaining when the fight ended. His success came not from superior aircraft or numerical advantage, but from superior shooting skill. On the bomber side, consider Staff Sergeant Michael Aruth, a B-17 ball turret gunner with the 8th Air Force. The ball turret, a spherical gun position hanging beneath the bomber, was cramped, uncomfortable, and terrifying. Aruth sat curled in this tiny space for hours during missions, watching the ground thousands of feet below through the turret's glass panels. When enemy fighters attacked from below, Aruth had to track them, calculate deflection while hanging upside down, and engage them while his entire bomber shook from engine vibration and evasive maneuvers. Aruth was credited with 5 confirmed kills and several more probables. Exceptional performance for a gunner position that was inherently difficult to shoot from accurately. When asked his secret, Aruth explained his methodical approach to deflection shooting. He'd memorized the silhouettes and sizes of different enemy aircraft types. When one appeared, he'd instantly identify it,
estimate range based on its apparent size, and calculate the required lead. Then he'd place his tracers ahead of the target, watching for strikes. His disciplined approach and thorough understanding of deflection principles made him one of the most effective defensive gunners in his bomb group. Not all stories ended in success. Second Lieutenant James Hutchinson was a promising fighter pilot who excelled in training, showing good instincts for deflection shooting. On his third combat mission, Hutchinson engaged an enemy fighter and damaged it with a well-aimed deflection shot. But he made a common mistake. He fixated on his target, following it down to confirm the kill, forgetting to maintain awareness of other threats. Another enemy fighter attacked from Hutchinson's blind spot while he was focused on his first target. Hutchinson's aircraft was hit, and he was forced to bail out over enemy territory, becoming a prisoner of war. His story illustrates that deflection shooting skill alone wasn't enough. It had to be combined with situational awareness and tactical judgment. The best shooters remained alive not just because they could hit targets, but because they knew when to shoot, when to break off, and when to prioritize survival over a kill. Technical Sergeant Benjamin Warner served as an instructor at an aerial gunnery school in the United States. Warner had never seen combat, but he became a master of deflection shooting through thousands of hours on the training range. He could estimate range by eye with remarkable accuracy and could judge the correct deflection for any angle of attack instantly. His students sometimes resented learning from someone who'd never been in combat, but Warner's methods were vindicated when his students consistently achieved higher combat performance than students from other instructors. Warner's story illustrates that becoming an expert shooter didn't necessarily require combat experience. It required understanding principles and deliberate practice. The skill itself was teachable through proper training, even without the forge of combat. Of course, combat added elements that no training could fully replicate, but the fundamental shooting skill could be developed stateside. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski, with 28 victories in Europe and 6.5 in Korea, demonstrated the enduring value of deflection shooting skills. Gabreski's career spanned propeller aircraft in World War II and jets in Korea. Despite the dramatic differences in aircraft performance, the principles of deflection shooting remained the same. Gabreski's mastery of these principles, learned in P-47s in 1943, served him equally well in F-86 Sabres in 1951. The speeds were higher and the time windows shorter, but the underlying skill, judging where a moving target will be and placing fire at that point, was identical. Technical Sergeant Arthur Benko flew 35 missions as a waist gunner on B-24 bombers in the Pacific. Benko never achieved an aerial victory. He never definitively shot down an enemy aircraft. Yet his skill in deflection shooting was crucial to his bomber's survival. Benko's accurate fire drove off numerous attacking fighters, forcing them to break off their attacks before they could effectively engage his bomber. His tracers, consistently leading targets correctly, convinced enemy pilots that pressing their attacks would be fatal. This defensive success, measured not in kills but in attacks disrupted and damage prevented, was perhaps the most important role of bomber defensive gunnery. A gunner who could reliably place accurate fire near attacking fighters achieved his primary goal, protecting his aircraft and crew. Kills were a bonus. Survival was the objective. Second Lieutenant Robert Johnson became an ace despite having his aircraft badly damaged in an early mission when an enemy fighter got on his tail. Johnson survived that attack through luck and the poor gunnery of his opponent. The experience taught him a visceral lesson about the importance of shooting first and shooting accurately. Johnson thereafter approached every engagement with aggressive energy tactics, setting up high deflection shots that he could take quickly and then break away before counterattack. Johnson's 27 victories came not from being the best pilot or having the best aircraft, but from combining solid flying skills with exceptional deflection shooting ability. He practiced constantly, even on non-combat flights, imagining enemy aircraft and practicing tracking them with his gun sight, mentally calculating the required lead. This mental rehearsal kept his skills sharp and his mind prepared for the geometric problems of deflection shooting. The story of the entire crew of Memphis Belle, one of the first B-17s to complete 25 missions over Europe, illustrates the collective nature of defensive gunnery success. No single gunner on Memphis Belle was an ace, but together, the crew's gunners drove off countless attacks through coordinated, accurate deflection shooting. They communicated effectively, covered each other's blind spots, and consistently applied proper leading technique. Their survival through 25 missions in 1943, when bomber losses were catastrophic, was testament to effective crew gunnery. These human stories reveal several common threads. First, success in deflection shooting came to those who approached it systematically and intellectually, not just instinctually. Second, practice mattered enormously. The best shooters practiced constantly, even outside of combat. Third, understanding the principles underlying deflection shooting was more valuable than memorizing rules for specific situations. Fourth, shooting skill had to be integrated with broader tactical awareness. The best gunners knew when to shoot, not just how.
Legacy: deflection shooting in modern warfare. The lessons learned from World War II deflection shooting have echoed through the decades, influencing how military forces train for air combat, even in the jet age and beyond. While technology has advanced dramatically, the fundamental challenge, hitting a moving target from a moving platform, remains essentially unchanged. In the Korean War, just a few years after World War II ended, American pilots faced an unexpected challenge: the MiG-15, a Soviet-designed jet fighter that outperformed American jets in some key areas. Yet American pilots achieved a favorable kill ratio, shooting down approximately 10 MiGs for every American aircraft lost in air-to-air combat. While this success had multiple causes, superior training in deflection shooting was consistently cited as a key factor. American pilots, many of whom were World War II veterans or trained by World War II veterans, had internalized deflection shooting principles. They understood how to lead a target, how to adjust for relative motion, and how to make effective high deflection shots. Many Soviet and Chinese pilots, despite having capable aircraft, hadn't received the same depth of gunnery training. They would aim directly at targets and miss, exactly as American pilots had done in early World War II before the training revolution. The Vietnam War presented new challenges. The emphasis on missile armament in early jet fighter designs meant some aircraft, like early versions of the F-4 Phantom, didn't even carry guns. The theory was that long-range missiles had made dogfighting obsolete. This theory proved disastrously wrong when missiles were unreliable and many engagements occurred at ranges where only guns were effective. American pilots found themselves in gun combat without adequate training in deflection shooting. The institutional knowledge had partially eroded during the missile focus era. Kill ratios dropped alarmingly. In response, the Navy established Top Gun, formerly the Navy Fighter Weapons School, specifically to address this training deficiency. Among the key skills taught was deflection shooting, the same principles developed 25 years earlier in World War II. When Top Gun graduates returned to combat squadrons, kill ratios improved dramatically. The Air Force established similar programs, and both services relearned the lesson. Regardless of technological advances, the fundamental skill of leading a moving target remains crucial. Gun camera footage from Vietnam showed the same pattern seen in World War II, pilots aiming directly at targets and missing, versus pilots properly leading targets and achieving hits. The technology had changed, but the physics and psychology hadn't.
Modern air combat training continues to emphasize deflection shooting, now enhanced by sophisticated simulator technology. Student pilots can practice hundreds of engagements in simulators, receiving instant feedback on their deflection accuracy. Computer analysis shows exactly where they aimed, where they should have aimed, and the mathematical relationship between the two. This accelerated learning cycle builds the same instincts that World War II pilots developed, but more efficiently. Yet, even with all this technology, the fundamental challenge remains: overcoming the instinct to aim directly at visible targets. Modern flight instructors report that student pilots still struggle with the counterintuitive nature of deflection shooting. The human brain, even the 21st century brain raised on video games and high-speed sports, still finds it unnatural to aim at empty air while a target sits clearly visible elsewhere in the sight picture. The principles of deflection shooting have applications beyond air-to-air combat. Anti-aircraft gunners face the same challenge, leading high-speed targets. Even missile systems, which do their own guidance, need to be launched at a lead angle toward where the target will be, not where it is. Naval gunnery for anti-aircraft defense applies deflection principles. The underlying mathematics, the physics of intercept geometry, and even the psychological challenges of counterintuitive aiming show up across all of these domains.